Ranking Member Khanna, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for convening this hearing. My name is Patrick Cashman, and I serve as President of U.S. Antibiotics, headquartered in Bristol, Tennessee. We are the last domestic manufacturer of amoxicillin, the most prescribed antibiotic in the United States. We formulate, fill, and finish the drug entirely in America, and we have never purchased our active pharmaceutical ingredients from China. The amoxicillin supply chain has 3 layers: key starting materials, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and finished dosage forms. China dominates the foundational layers. In October 2025, U.S. Pharmacopeia analysis found China is the sole supplier of at least one key starting material for 37% of all U.S. approved medicines. India, often is seen as an alternative, relies on China for about 90% of its amoxicillin precursor chemistry. The apparent diversity on pharmacy shelves is largely an illusion. 1 in 3 U.S. hospitals experienced severe effects from the 2022-2023 amoxicillin shortage, which resulted from routine supply chain fragility, not foreign interference. A geopolitically motivated restriction, as seen recently with critical minerals, would be faster and more severe. The quality gap increases the security risk. A 2025 study from Indiana University and Ohio State University found serious adverse events, including hospitalization, disability, and death, were 54% higher for generic drugs made in India than those made in the United States. Domestic facilities received unannounced inspections, while foreign facilities have historically received up to 12 weeks' notice, allowing time to conceal issues. A 2023 Pentagon review found the API country of origin was unknown for 22% of drugs for service members. We cannot protect a supply chain we cannot see. Our facility has supplied amoxicillin to American patients for over 40 years. Until 2008, every U.S. amoxicillin prescription was filled from our Bristol plant. A decade of subsidized foreign competition eliminated our market share and forced our previous owners into bankruptcy. In 2021, Jackson Healthcare acquired us as a national security commitment, not a business investment. Our parent company has invested tens of millions of private dollars to restore domestic production while absorbing losses. We compete with foreign manufacturers who benefit from state subsidies, lax oversight, and prices that sometimes fall below our raw material costs. We accept these disadvantages because the alternative poses a national security risk. However, our ability to overcome these challenges is not unlimited. If we close permanently, rebuilding from scratch would take a decade, assuming capital, regulatory approval, and a skilled workforce are available. None of these are guaranteed. This committee can take specific actions to help preserve U.S. pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity. First, define domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing as the process of formulating, filling, and finishing drugs from API so that the federal procurement preferences reward companies that actually make medicine in America. Second, direct strategic national stockpile to prioritize domestic manufacturing through multi-year purchasing agreements. Third, signal bipartisan support for the ongoing Section 232 investigations into pharmaceutical imports and urge prominent treatment for the upstream supply chain, the KSMs and the APIs, where China's chokehold is the tightest and the consequences of disruption are the most immediate. America's most prescribed antibiotic can be made entirely in the United States, and for more than 40 years it was. We have the facility, the expertise, and the production capacity to do it again. My colleagues and I are looking for this committee to help create a policy framework that treats domestic production of critical medicines as the national security priority it is. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
My name is Marta Wosińska, and I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. I am testifying today in my personal expert capacity. I am an economist with expertise in prescription drug markets, and I have been studying resilience of generic drug supply chains for about 15 years. Over these years, I have seen many policy ideas in this space fall short. Many ideas sound good and strong and intuitive, but they often fail to grapple with 4 key questions. Today, I want to use those 4 questions to frame how we should think about de-risking our drug supply chains' dependence on China. Question number 1, what problem are we trying to solve? We often hear that about 80% of plants that make active ingredients for our drugs are outside the United States. If we treat that as the problem, then onshoring those plants sounds like the obvious fix. But if our concern is China, we must recognize that China controls the chemical precursors those plants need. If China shuts off those chemicals, it won't help that an active ingredient plant sits on US soil. If we want to de-risk from China, we need to de-risk those chemical inputs. Question number 2, for the solutions to work, what else must happen? Any serious effort to de-risk from China will cost money. There is no free lunch. To make progress, Congress must be willing to allocate funding for a more secure chemical and generic manufacturing capacity and to pay more for the products that come from it. At this point, you might reasonably ask, aren't we already spending too much on drugs and you want us to spend more? But please remember, I am only talking about generics. Generics account for more than 90% of prescriptions, but only a small share of drug spending. A life-saving hospital medicine may earn a generic manufacturer less than a cup of coffee. A 30-day supply of a chronic generic drug sells to pharmacies for less than $1.50. For these generic staples of American healthcare, we must be willing to pay more for supply chains that are not built on cheap Chinese inputs. Question number 3, what is the best use of limited dollars? The scope of our dependence is so broad that we must prioritize which supply chains to secure first, recognizing that we must secure more than just the active ingredient and finished dosage form steps we normally call drug manufacturing. If policymakers sprinkle taxpayer dollars across many drug supply chains without clear priorities, they risk spending a lot and changing very little. The smart path is to reserve full end-to-end onshoring for critical drugs for which we are likely to compete with China and with others in a pandemic or a major natural disaster. Think emergency room medicines, antibiotics, and intensive care sedatives. For the widely used everyday medicines that treat hypertension, high cholesterol, and depression, we should lean on friendshoring. Friendshoring lets us leverage the fact that most of our exposure to Chinese chemicals is not direct, but runs through India and Europe, countries that supply our market but rely on Chinese inputs. Those countries are also concerned about their own exposure to China and are working to decrease it, benefiting us along the way. Question number 4, how do we avoid unintended consequences? Congress has a critical role here. If tariff policy, procurement rules, and payment reforms send weak or mixed signals, and purchasers keep paying only for the cheapest version, manufacturers at home and in allied countries will keep leaning on low-cost Chinese inputs. We have already seen firms in allied countries shift critical manufacturing capacity toward China because buyers would not pay for the de-risked production. This is the opposite of what we want. So, as you consider legislation, the question is not only whether a policy sounds tough on China and enhances onshoring, but also whether it enhances friendshoring. Congress can help by locking in clearer, long-term signals in statute on tariffs and reliability-based payments, so that our policies support our allies' efforts to lower their dependence on China, and in doing so, make our own drug supply chains more secure. If you would like more detail, I refer you to my written testimony, which lays out these issues in much more detail. And thank you again for inviting me to participate, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Beecraft and Dr. Jimenez, in the last 5 years, China went from 0 to 48% of large global pharmaceutical licensing deals. We've seen this trajectory before in other sectors. At what point does the United States lose the ability to reverse course in biotech the way we lost the ability to reverse course in manufacturing sectors?
I think we lose our ability to do so when we lose this unstructured interplay between all these components. So when the financing environment moves to China, essentially the VCs move to China, that's going to hollow out our ability to have local biotech companies in the United States, and that's going to reduce the amount of clinical trials we have here, and then we are also going to have pharmas seeking to license drugs from China. So I think from my perspective and in my vantage point, a lot of the system is managed through financial incentives, and that's going to be when we stop seeing it as valuable to invest in local US-based companies. That's really going to be, to me, the bellwether that it's over.
To actually build on my colleague's statement there, I actually believe that this movement is very much underway and accelerating. One thing to understand about the biotech industrial base that we have here in the United States as it relates to drug discovery is just how fragile it is. So companies like mine, for instance, we don't make any money. We don't sell any drugs. We're a research and development organization that is 100% dependent on investor capital or partner capital to come in to pay for the very large prices of drug development. If you compare that to the manufacturing sector, which took decades to decay and go overseas to China and others, those are industries backed by both revenue, solid assets, real estate, CapEx, that took many, many years to decay. If the financial incentives, as my colleague just mentioned, begin to shift where investors and partners want to invest into Chinese competitors and license Chinese assets, the flywheel is on the order of a few years to completely collapse the ecosystem. A number of public biotech companies have less than 18 months of cash on hand. And so if you cannot raise money and you cannot sell things, your company will die. And that will happen very quickly.
In the budget recently signed into law by the president, increased funding for NIH. What can Congress do in the short term, in the next 2 years, to address clinical trial migration and early stage drug development migration to China? In the next 2 years, what can Congress do?
Very simply, I think the best thing we could possibly do is allow the FDA to get to first-in-human clinical data as quickly as possible, such that our biotech companies can compete with China on clinical trial data.
Between coupling and incentivizing small-scale manufacturing, the FDA can also work with companies to find correct regulations for the stage at which a drug is being tested, manufacturing requirements on those drugs, especially for complex new medicines. And in addition, like I also laid out in my written testimony, we need to move faster to first-in-human clinical data. I think that China today is the best at running from idea to dosing a first-in-human and getting that critical early stage first-in-human data. They don't aspire to be the greatest country at running first-in-human clinical data, and I think it's on everyone here on this committee to recognize that.
In the case of generic manufacturing, I don't know if we have a lot to offer in this particular thing, but one thing I would mention that was very favorable is recently the Commissioner's Voucher Program was very instrumental in us bringing some products back to the market quickly. And I think anything that would move products closer to approval quickly, such as a rapid review of data, would be beneficial to the industry.
I'll just, echo here what Patrick Cushman just said, in that this is, the drug development piece of it is really for the other witnesses to offer. I have plenty of recommendations of what Congress could do in the next 2 years on generic drug supply chains, but I think that's a different question.
Thank you. And if I could just end by asking you a yes or no question. Should Congress require the FDA to inspect and verify foreign trial data before accepting it? And what would that do to the economics of offshoring early trials, if so? But yes or no question.
Yes. Do you want a response to the other piece of your question?
I want to be sensitive to the time, but yes. If you could just, and then anyone who wants to add to it, but go ahead.
I think one piece about trying to change the economics is understanding two different things, right? So there is the cost of first-in-human data and how that inflects the value of a given experimental asset, right? And then there is the use of that data in a future trial. The reason first-in-human data is so important is because it is the most hard to raise money for an idea to test. Changing those economics in terms of like making someone redo a phase 1 trial in the United States does not appreciably solve the problem if it is so radically cheaper to get that data in another country. Increase your value, the economics that follow behind that will mostly remain the same.
So I'll answer yes, but the second part of your question is a little bit more complex in that I don't think it'll necessarily immediately drop better level the playing field with costs, because there's two things we have to think about here. One is data submitted to the FDA for review, and that of course will be important. But the other part is that when investors are looking at data, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be FDA reviewable. Frequently it just has to be, if you tested a drug in China and it worked on 30 people, an investor will put money behind it. They're happy to put a tremendous amount of money behind that to redo those studies in the US. So it's really the time to information that's really the tricky part here. And so that's why it's just not immediately going to have an effect on costs.
The answer is yes. I think anytime, as we see with manufacturing, and the FDA needs the resources, adequate resources to do inspections, whether it's for manufacturing or for clinical studies.
Mr. Cashman, I found your testimony and your work very interesting. Appreciate what you're doing to try to bring amoxicillin production back to the U.S. My understanding from your testimony is that you don't think tariffs are going to be enough. And the way I understood your testimony is that we're not producing the key starting materials here. We're not producing the APIs here. They're sole source. They're being produced in China. So even if we tariff them, we're still dependent on them, and we're basically paying them a higher amount because of the tariff, but it's not doing anything to bring the actual production here. Is that an accurate read of your testimony?
Yes, Ranking Member Kolinar, that is accurate. In fact, there's so much. The Chinese government doesn't look at this as a profitable enterprise. They don't look at it as a business enterprise. I believe they look at it as a strategic asset that they can use to leverage against us. So the cost of production is irrelevant to them. They'll work to drive anybody out of business if they have to, and that's what they've done in the past, and we've seen that in many, many different models across many industries.
So it seems to me, while I'm a supporter of strategic tariffs to make sure that China isn't dumping, that certainly they're not dumping steel or things that we produce, in cases where we have lacked industrial capability, tariffs alone are not going to solve the issue. And what we need to do, in my view, is what we've done from the time of Alexander Hamilton, which is actually have an industrial policy in areas that are of critical national security and critical economic security. It seems to me that key starting materials and active pharmaceutical ingredients are one of those areas. How much do you think it would cost the United States if we were to have federal procurement agreements and help finance production for key starting materials and for the APIs for something like amoxicillin? I mean, it seems to me it wouldn't be that big of an investment that we could bring these industries back onshore.
In the overall scheme of things, Ranking Member Kolinar, it would be a very modest investment. When I look at the cost of our medications versus competitors from India and China, we're literally a few cents a dose difference from those costs. When we look at the cost of API from China compared to other sources, the difference can be as much as 20 to 40%. So it's a significant cost difference. But to have an investment here in the United States to produce API would be, a relatively modest investment compared to many things we spend money on.
And that would be the biggest game changer, right? I mean, if we had kind of a chip slack like we did for semiconductors, if we did that for key starting materials and API, and if we had federal procurement for it, like the president in his first term did with Operation Warp Speed, where we had federal procurement for the vaccines. I mean, that kind of policy, in your view, could get a lot of the key starting material and API back into the United States?
Yes, Ranking Member Kolinar, I believe that would be very helpful, but we also have to keep in mind that the Chinese will continue to drive prices down. So there needs to be mechanisms to control or restrict the market access of some of those products.
I'm all for having restrictive tariffs on them. I just want to make sure we're making stuff too, because if we don't make the stuff, we can tariff it all we want. There's no factory, there's no production, and it seems to me that the key here is to actually get the production. You said you're about 8% of the amoxicillin market, right? And
yes,
I mean, and your biggest choke point is these materials, correct? Not getting the, if we had more of the key starting materials and the API here, you'd be able to expand dramatically, correct?
Additional key starting materials and API would be helpful for us, yes, of course. But we're also competing with very low-cost drugs coming from India and China, and we have to compete with those products.
It seems to me a combination of strategic tariffs and smart industrial policies is what we need. And Chair Molinar, if there's a desire to have some kind of collaboration on this kind of a policy, I'd welcome working on that.
When a patient's on the table and you reach for a drug, you need that drug to be there. You need to know where it came from. You need to know that it works. And there's no time for supply chain discussions at that point when somebody's bleeding out. The clinical reality is exactly what this hearing is about, except that the patient on the table is now the United States of America. We've handed the Chinese Communist Party the instrument tray. And, I've spent much of my career in two institutions, medicine and the Army, institutions that take readiness seriously. You don't wait until a crisis to build your supply chain. You harden it in advance, and you know your vulnerabilities, and, you never let a strategic adversary control your logistics. On all three counts, I think we have failed in pharmaceuticals in America, and this committee has an obligation to say so plainly. Here are some of the facts that we have stumbled upon in the last few years, Mr. Chairman. About 90% of the drugs Americans take are generics. The active pharmaceutical ingredients in those drugs, the molecules that actually do the work, if you will, are overwhelmingly manufactured in or dependent upon China. And for generic antibiotics, roughly 90% of API supply originates in or flows through Chinese manufacturing. For heparin, a blood thinner I have frequently used over the years, essentially all global processing happens in China, all of it. That's not a trade policy problem, that's a medical readiness problem, and it's a national security problem. And in a conflict scenario or even a targeted export restriction, Americans are going to die because of this. I want this committee to understand that this hearing is not about the supply chain vulnerabilities we've already accepted, as serious as those are. It's about where China's going next. China is executing a deliberate, patient strategy to move up the pharmaceutical value chain. And in 2020, Chinese communists were involved in the virtually 0% in 2020 of major global drug licensing deals. Today, they're involved in nearly half. In 2014, China ran fewer than 2,000 clinical trials. In 23, they ran over 11,000. As a physician who knows how long it takes to build genuine clinical trial infrastructure, those numbers don't happen by accident. They happen by design, and that's how the CCP is working. And they've done this with rare earths, solar energy, batteries, electric vehicles, all these critical sectors that they dominate and they subsidize. And they move up the supply chain until they own the whole stack of the supply chain. China's goal is not to be a supplier to our pharma companies. Their goal is to replace our pharma companies. And based on the trajectory we're on, they're well positioned to do just exactly that. As someone who's spent his career in both medicine and in the military service, I can tell you this kind of vulnerability does not announce itself until it's too late. We don't find out we have a supply chain problem when everything is fine. We find out when we're in a crisis and the shelves are empty. And I'm grateful to you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this committee. Dr. Vashinka, sorry about that. It's good to see you again. Thank you for your leadership in this space. When we met in December, we talked about this very issue. When I read your report, you highlighted that many of the API exposure statistics are incredibly inconsistent, with some being reporting 8%, some 90%. So how do we actually know, how exposed we are in terms of API supply?
Thank you for this question. You're right. It's almost pick your number on our exposure to China when it comes to API. Some sources will say it's 8%, and some will say it's 90%. I would say it's probably closer to 25%. And one reason is, it's really important to understand that it varies by therapeutic class. We definitely have significantly higher exposure for antibiotics than for a lot of other drugs. But I think some of this is that those who are looking at these data are either mischaracterizing which part of the supply chain we're talking about. They're thinking about API as anything that precedes it as well. But that's a different vulnerability and different policy solutions that are coming in. So some of it is that. Some of it is misinterpreting India's reliance on China. We can really very easily see how much they import from China. We don't see how much they make in terms of API. So a lot of the mischaracterizations come from that. What I will say, even 25% is very concerning, especially that it's in other settings as well, like in antibiotics is significantly higher. And what's also really important is that they're moving strongly in that direction. So back to what Congress could do, I wanted to flag something really interesting about tariffs and how tariffs are structured, and the fact that India relies increasingly on Chinese inputs, including API, because China is moving into API and really sort of growing the footprint. The way a tariff works for prescription drugs, almost always, it is the finished dosage form manufacturer will pay it based on where the API comes from. So an Indian manufacturer using Chinese API will actually pay the Chinese tariff. One reason why I was really concerned about tariffs on India is that India is trying to de-risk their own supply chains. And if we were to impose a tariff on them, we would probably, they would either not have enough of a margin and they would leave the market, or they might want to go for the cheapest and go towards China. And we were basically potentially going to increase our exposure to China by pushing Indian manufacturers there. Where a tariff is great, and this is where I actually would recommend sending a much stronger signal to manufacturers in India. If you use Chinese API, you will pay a tariff. So putting a tariff on Chinese, taking the existing 10% tariff on Chinese manufacturers, which is not very high, increasing it, and then putting this in place in statute would send a much stronger signal to Indian manufacturers not to use Chinese API. So this is an opportunity for Congress to actually be very strategic about tariffs.
Today's hearing is about something very real for the people I represent, whether they can reliably and affordably access the medicines they depend on, and whether we, as a nation, are building that capacity here at home or outsourcing it abroad. In Ohio's 11th district, we have some of the best healthcare systems and research institutions in the country, from the Cleveland Clinic and Metro Health to university hospitals and Case Western Reserve, alongside a workforce with a long history in advanced manufacturing. So when we talk about pharmaceutical supply chains, we're not just talking about global competition. We're talking about whether communities, like the ones I represent, are positioned to produce, innovate, and deliver the medicines we all rely on. Right now, we know that too much of the upstream supply chain, key ingredients and materials that go into essential drugs, is concentrated in China. And at the same time, China is moving aggressively into drug development and clinical research. Those developments create both short-term vulnerabilities in access to components and long-term risk to American leadership in innovation and production. For Northeast Ohio, this is also about economic opportunity. We have the institutions, the talent, and the infrastructure to be part of the solution, but only if federal policy is aligned to support domestic manufacturing, strengthen our research ecosystem, and build resilient supply chains with trusted partners. Because at the end of the day, this is about more than competition. It's about health security, economic security, and making sure American communities are not lost or left behind. So Dr. Wolszynska, you've highlighted that our greatest vulnerabilities are often upstream, such as the level of key starting materials or active ingredients. What are the top targeted actions we should take right now to reduce our dependence on China for essential medicines that patients rely on every day?
Thank you so much for this question. For essential medicines, the ones that were likely to compete with China in a conflict, and frankly with any other country, I really do think that full onshoring of those medicines, including figuring out ways to make the key starting materials here, either chemically or using synthetic biology, is the way to do this. This is, again, not going to happen on its own. There needs to be funding for this. And if you think about we're thinking about national security, and it's good to put it in the context of how much DoD spends on, let's say, a fighter jet. It might be close to $100 million per fighter jet. The Office of Industrial Base in Asper, since I think the last 6 years, their budget was $188 million. They're supposed to be the ones helping to build that infrastructure in the US. So we're talking about 2-3 jets over 6 years. So, again, this is a big call to Congress. Chair Molinar, this is a way for Congress to step in, and, the money needs to come with that. But those medicines are actually a very small slice of what we take. If you were to take the Asper 86 top essential medicines, I would be surprised if they ever made up 1% of the patients that touched 1% of the patients that are in the US. We really need to be thinking strategically about what we're going to do about everything else: statins, SSRIs, blood pressure medications. This is where working with allies, I think, is really critical. In an ideal world, we would onshore everything, but again, where's the money coming from? So we need to think about how can we work with India to have them de-risk themselves so that we can continue to have those medicines, which is, if you think about your constituents, they're probably more likely to be on a statin than end up in an emergency room and need a critical medicine. So we need to be thinking about both.
A very important topic, and something that deals with not only our economic security, but also national security issues and the general health and well-being of our American citizens. So I want to start with Mr. Cashman, if I could. Thank you for coming, Mr. Cashman. Appreciate your testimony. You talked about the amoxicillin shortage back in 22 and 23. So if you could, I'd like you to share a little bit more about what you went through during that period, but also help us understand what the federal government could be doing to support manufacturers to help prevent shortages? And if they do occur, if shortages do occur, what kinds of things should we be thinking about to help mitigate those impacts?
Thank you, Congressman. Excellent question. In 2022-23, we were just getting back, restarting our facility. So we were starting to ramp up production, scaling up, hiring people, bringing the production back online. And unfortunately, we weren't fully ready to deal with a shortage like that. We did the best we could, and we ran as hard as we could to do that. And we were able to provide quite a bit of medication to people. What needs to be done? I think there needs to be additional investment in equipment, in bringing people, in training people, and bringing people online to train more, to have higher levels of production. I think one thing that's very important to consider for this group is that the federal government buys a lot of medication, and that can help drive U.S. domestic manufacturing. The small business set-aside paradox is really something that is very quickly, easily remedied. It requires no appropriations, no regulatory overhaul, no international negotiation. It just requires a narrow clarification that national security considerations can override set-aside classifications when a genuine domestic manufacturer of a critical medication is excluded from competition. So just using that demand as a lever to help generate and drive domestic manufacturing can be very helpful to domestic manufacturing.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Can I chime in on amoxicillin?
Oh, sure. Just real quickly, sure.
Just really quickly, so amoxicillin was a really interesting shortage. It was really driven by a demand increase. And this is a great example of us competing with other countries and us potentially losing because of how our system is structured. We pay a lot less for generics than other countries do. We pay a lot more for brands, but a lot less for generics. And what was really interesting is that for manufacturers to shift more of their sales to the United States, basically they were getting paid more in Europe for these drugs, but if they were to sell them here at anything like the prices that they were getting somewhere else, they would have to pay Medicaid inflation rebates. So we were sort of in this very uncomfortable position, manufacturers were, to sort of how do you play here when somebody else outside of the United States was paying them more? And I'm not talking about China, I'm talking about Europe. So, you know, if you look at my testimony, I do, and I have written in the past that we need to be also thinking about some of the payment mechanisms and potentially making adjustments there.